When mixing, EQ is often applied in stages, a little bit at a time. People typically start going through the tracks individually, then build up the mix by adding more and more in together, EQing as they go. As the ears get accustomed to the sound of the tracks with EQ applied, they tend to forget what the recording sounded like initially, without any processing. Whatever it was we liked about the EQ we added, we sometimes want to hear more of that, and when our ears get used to the EQ tone, we might be tempted to add in even more of the same. Couple that with the need to re-EQ as more tracks are mixed together, which I'll get into in the next clip, and you have a recipe for potential EQ abuse. The surest way to avoid the potential over-application or misuse of EQ is to make liberal use of the processor's bypass button as sort of a tonal reality check. Like I said, our ears have a short memory span when it comes to tone. They tend to forget the original tonality of a recording, adjusting to the EQ'd tone, pretty much the same way our eyes adjust to the dark after a while. But if the tracks have been well recorded, with well-chosen mics, or if synth sounds have been well designed and programmed, they shouldn't really need that much EQ in the first place. It's easy to gradually pull a track so far away from the natural tone of the instrument or sound that you end up doing further EQing to address problems with the EQ'd tone that could have been avoided by simply applying more subtle EQ in the first place. It's always a good idea to periodically bypass the EQ frequently during the process, working on both individual tracks and tracks combined in the mix. I'm often surprised by just how different a bypass track sounds when I do this. Sometimes I really thought I'd barely change the natural tone, as I'd intended, but in reality, the gradual EQ bumps I'd accumulated were giving the tracks a noticeably processed tone, and the original had a much smoother quality, which I preferred, even if it did need some EQ. My ears had just gotten used to the amount of processing I'd been using. Another benefit of hitting bypass often is to keep the levels honest. EQ is really changing the gain of the signal, even though it's only doing it within selected frequency ranges. Ideally, when you add EQ, you don't want the overall level of the track to change. If you've done a rough mix to start, without processing, as you EQ the tracks, the EQ in and of itself shouldn't change how they sit in the mix level-wise. You should always use the EQ's output gain control to make sure the EQ'd version is at the same level as the unprocessed bypassed version. This way, when you do use the bypass function to see how you're progressing with the tonal balance, you won't be distracted by level differences, which would make it impossible to get a good sense of what the EQ changes may be contributing, for better or worse. If you've kept the EQ'd and bypassed levels consistent, then you can also bypass all EQ on the entire mix as well as a check. I know from experience that even when I may be satisfied with a mix at the end of a long day, if I come back to that mix the next day, hearing it with fresher ears will quickly reveal any exaggerated or dubious EQ choices that need to be dialed down.
Promises are always so enticing. Out of sight, out of mind, fall for it every time.
Unfortunately, this revelation might happen after the mix has been finalized or sent off to the client, complicating the needed fixes. Quickly A-Bing the mix with and without EQ can often show up some EQ choices as unnecessary, overdone, or misapplied, when you hear them immediately contrasted with the natural, unprocessed tone of the instruments and voices.
Always so enticing. Out of sight, out of mind, fall for it every time. Watch out, here they come.
Of course, the bypass button is your friend when it comes to all kinds of processing, but it's an especially useful way of countering the ear's tendency to adapt to tonal changes and maintain a more realistic sense of just how far you're deviating from the natural sound of the recordings. Let's just say I wouldn't want to EQ a mix without it.